Hello, I'm Scott Ormond from Arrowsmith Press, and I'm speaking today with Thomas O'Grady, who is a poet from Prince Edward Island, where he joins me today, I believe. And he was born and bred in Prince Edward Island and studied at the University of Prince Edward Island, I understand, but also at University College Dublin and the University of, now is it Notre Dame or Notre Dame? Because I'm an Australian, so
Notre Dame.
didn't think to check that. Yeah, Notre
Yeah,
Dame.
the American pronunciation is Notre Dame.
Great, of course. And also he has taught at University of Massachusetts, Boston, and has been published in numerous places in the US and elsewhere. And among other things, he's the author of two previous collections of poems, Delivering the News from 2019 and What Really Matters from 2000. Did I get those years wrong way around?
No, those are the right years.
Yeah. And we also have this latest work called Coming Ashore, which Arrowsmith will be launching on May 10 at the Friends Meeting House in Cambridge, Boston at 4 p.m. So, Thomas, thank you so much for joining me. And it's really good to meet you. And I have to start by saying congratulations on the new work. I found it really striking and arresting and epiphanic and reflective. I wanted to start by asking you about the title and the structure of the work because it's called Coming Ashore, and I noticed that the new poems you call nuage, I believe it's pronounced, which is a French word for clouds, but also the name of a piece of music by Django Reinhardt, who I can see you're a fan of. And it's divided into two parts. We have surfacing part one and part two, reckoning. So I couldn't help but wonder what the title and that structure means for you, because Coming Ashore as a title, of course, also embraces pieces from the previous works, which, as I mentioned, are called What Really Matters and Delivering the News. So I just wonder, does it represent some kind of accounting, or that has that connotation, but also emergence? Do you have any thoughts about what you were thinking with that title
Sure.
and arrangement?
Yeah, I can respond to that. Before we proceed, though, I want to clarify that I'm not on Prince Edward Island at the moment, alas.
Oh,
I'm in South Bend, Indiana, where I spend most of the year. So I just wanted to make that clear that I'm on the banks of the
thank you.
St. Joe River in South Bend, Indiana. But as for the title of the book, the title emerged very serendipitously when Oswald Melnichuk, the publisher of Arrowsmith Press, approached me about doing a new and selected poems in August of 2023. I was caught off guard. Oswald and I are close friends, and I never would have imagined working with him as a publisher because of that. I wasn't sure that I would never have made the overture to him. But he told me, I want to publish your new and selected poems. And I said to him, I don't have a new and selected poems. And he said, you will. And we left it at that until December of 2023, when we met again and had lunch. And he said, so I would like the manuscript by October. And I said, so you were serious? And he said, yes.
Mm.
Um, and I still didn't have any idea, any concept for a new collection of poems. And I had poems that were accumulating because I was writing poems as they came to me, but I wasn't writing with a program in mind or anything else. I never have and probably never will. But what happened very serendipitously was that for Christmas of 2023, I gave my wife, as the final gift of Christmas, an etching by the Newfoundland artist David Blackwood, which is the cover image of the book.
Yeah.
And we have been admirers of David Blackwood for probably close to 30 years. When we first discovered him, we couldn't afford to buy a David Blackwood print. And even as we became more affluent over the years, the prices of his prints went up. But I happened to find one that is titled Coming Ashore. And I bought it actually in August of 2023, hid it for 4 months, and then gave it to her for Christmas. And when we came back to South Bend, we were out in Rhode Island for Christmas. When we came back to South Bend, we hung it on the wall here, and within minutes, I was writing what became the title poem of the book that was prompted by the image.
Yeah.
But the poem itself, I would say, is not an interpretation of the image so much as it was kind of an invitation that the image gave me. And the opening, the first two words of the poem, of the title poem, are "we age."
Mm-hmm.
And when I wrote those words, and I don't know where they came from, except that we are aging, that just kind of opened the floodgate of the poem. And I just followed from there and recognized in my reading of the image that there's a young boy at the prow of the dory, and there are 5 other men in the dory who are obviously older, and that they seem to be holding on for dear life, whereas the young man is anticipating dear life. And so that became the poem, and then that poem allowed me to have perspective on some of the poems I had been writing already about time and aging and so on. So that's where the title of the book comes from. It comes from the title of the poem, which comes from the title of the image. And I
Yes. Yeah.
and I do have to give a shout out when when all these pieces came into place. I said I need to have that image on the cover of my book,
Wonderful.
and so I was able to get in touch with David Blackwood's estate. He died in 2022. I was able to get in touch and request permission, and his wife, Anita Blackwood, gave me express permission, no fees, no funds,
Wow.
etc. And that was just an absolute gift that allowed the book to come into being as it is.
Yeah. Is it black and white charcoal?
No, it's actually an etching, a copper etching. It is black and white, but some of his etchings he colorizes as well, but he mostly works in black and white. And so that was one of the stipulations that Mrs. Blackwood gave, was that there be no coloring. It had to appear
Um,
in its original coloring, no coloring, no cropping, and just full attribution of her husband's name and the genre and so on. So that's where it all came from.
yeah. Well, it's a really wonderful opening poem that grew out of it, and you really help us. You really make us see it. Um, and I found it fascinating what you just said, because those were certainly themes that I was very moved by throughout the work, of themes of aging and time. I just felt the poem seemed very aware of time, and they made me experience something that I think, or made me conscious of something that I think you can only be conscious of or have experienced once you've passed a certain age, which I have, and that's the constant flow of time, the fact that it's constantly always moving. You can feel the sand grains of time flowing all the time. It's ceaseless. That's definitely in the opening poem, and as you said, you've got the various characters in different conditions with respect to time and age. And there's also the poem called East Race on page 26 that ends with the final 4 lines. You refer to the slow, grainy hourglass sip of salt-tipped sand. I gripped the balustrade, a pitching prow I held to the here and now. Yeah, I just felt with that passage and many others, this sense of really evoking that idea that it just doesn't stop. Time's just constantly moving. But the here and now is interesting. You've also got this epiphanic quality where you attend to a sudden burst of movement from a hawk or a turkey or something. So would you say time was a conscious theme, or is it just something that is so holistic and flooded with through your experience when you're constructing poems. Do these observations
Well,
resonate at all?
I think as an ordinary human being, like all of us, we all live in time and we all live in space. And I think that those are the two kind of factors that I am constantly aware of
Mm-hmm.
and tend to write about. And so that poem, East Race, that you alluded to, that was actually the very first poem that I wrote when we moved from Boston to South Bend, Indiana, 5 years ago. And the East Race is a man-made tributary that I can see from the window of our condo. It's off the St. Joe River here, and here I was all of a sudden after 36 years in Boston, standing and looking at this new world, and I was literally standing on the bridge across the East Race, and the poem came to me about how displaced I was and how in another place I was, but also in another time. And I was aware, I've never lived on a river before, so I was aware of living on a river, and I was aware of how that contrasts with where I grew up on Prince Edward Island, where one of the great comforts of my life is not only being on the South Shore of Prince Edward Island, but also thinking about the South Shore of Prince Edward Island. So that's where the references to the salt tip sand, which takes us to the hourglass image and that kind of thing. So it's that poem it was not. I didn't know where it was ever going to go, but it became a very important early statement for me of, okay, here I am. I'm someplace where I have did not imagine I was going to be, and now what am I feeling in the moment? And so that's where that poem came from. And so I think a lot of what I write about in my poems does involve time, and it does involve place and the connection between the two. Um, and we're all, as that opening poem says, we age, and I'm aware of it, and aware of being at a different point in life than I was when my first book of poems came out, which was 25 years ago. And so I was writing differently then. And then it took me 19 years for my second book to come out, but I was in a different place then as well. And so it's that poem. uh, It's a slight poem, but for me, it sort of articulates something essential.
Yeah, well, it did for me too. And yeah, I'm never sure. Obviously, the reader imports a lot of what's going on with them. So yeah, I was curious to know how conscious you were of those themes that I see very strong throughout many of the
Well,
works.
I will say in that poem, I was conscious. I was very conscious of it. But I think in a lot of other poems, it just filters in
Yeah,
because
because it's
we live
inevitable,
our lives.
inexorable. Yeah, it's a universal thing that everybody's dealing with and inform what they're doing. Um, when you were talking about place, San, I was thinking about your island experience, and it's obviously a huge part of your identity and way of seeing the world and being in the world. I wanted to ask if I could put a bit of shape on it. What it means to be an islander, because I'm from Australia, which is an island, you could say, but it's a continent island. But I've also spent a lot of time living in Tasmania, which I went there as an adult and lived there for about 12 years. And that's when I really started to reflect on the concept of the island. Um, it's obviously it gives you a heightened sense of certain aspects of landscape being bounded and everything. But I was also wondering if there's something psychological or existential about it regarding exile or remoteness or being cut off or being protected as well. Do those aspects of being an islander, do you identify with those elements?
In a combination of all of those, I think that one of the ways that I'm aware of myself as an islander, when I was growing up on Prince Edward Island, there's now a 9-mile bridge that links the island to New Brunswick. But when I was growing up, the only way to get off the island was by car ferry.
Mm-hmm.
and as islanders, I guess you could say we were insular, and we would talk about Prince Edward Island, and we would talk about the other side. So everything that wasn't Prince Edward Island was the other side,
So
the
yeah.
other side of Northumberland Strait. And there's also this expression that we still use that you're either from the island or you're from away.
Mhm.
And and so so that was something that I was born into and then was part of my being and my identity. But I think also that when you leave someplace that's distinctively bounded, as an island is, that you're very aware of the break from that place. If you live in Indiana, as I do now, and you cross the border into Ohio or into Michigan, or if you just drive south for 4 hours to southern Indiana, you're not as aware of crossing borders, of crossing boundaries.
Mm.
You're just aware of I'm in a vast place. And there's another poem. It's actually quite early in the book, um, which uses the conceit of Odysseus, um, finding himself in after he returned to Ithaca, setting out again, and it's on page 25,
Mm.
and he finds himself um, far from the ocean, and but he has his oar with him, and he plants it upright like a herder's staff,
Yeah.
uh, and but he feels weathered like a man left high and dry. And so that's kind of how, again, when I moved out here 5 years ago, that's how I felt. I felt kind of lost and uncertain of where I was. Where were the boundaries? Where were the markers? Living in Boston actually wasn't that difficult because Boston is bounded by Boston Harbor,
Mhm.
and you're aware of the shape of Boston and where Boston is. But the Midwest is the Midwest and is vast.
Mhm.
And so I think that was part of what I was responding to in various ways and in various poems. Um, and there's a poem from one of the earlier volumes. It's actually from Delivering the News, a poem called Seeing Red. And in that poem, it's a poem that's on page 91. It reflects on um, being in America at a particular point, politically and culturally, and as America was turning red, as we say with red states and blue
Yeah.
states,
Yeah.
but thinking of another red at home, the summons of the red trim on farm outbuildings that farmers would paint the trim red so that during blizzards in the winter they could find their way to the outbuildings to feed their cattle and to take care of the basic farm husbandry that they needed to. And so it was that um, sort of being in two places at one time, but using that word red as a kind of a pivot point between those two places and using it in very, very different ways. Uh,
Yeah. Yeah. That poem also ends with the the outlying island, barn, and shed.
yes. Yeah, and I capitalize island. It's not a lowercase island. I am a lowercase islander, but I'm also an uppercase islander, and that's very
But
important.
yeah, because it's part of the name. It's part of the proper
Yes.
noun. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm. Yeah. So that makes me think about another feature of your poems. Well, they're often very painterly, um, but they also have a musical quality, obviously very sonic. And your interest, saw somewhere that you think of your you think in terms of sound sequences, uh,
Hmm.
but you also have a storytelling impulse. And I was curious about, as a fiction writer, I was curious about. I know you've taught short story as well, but how do those two things go together? So I can see them. They're both. I can see them clearly in your work, but I'm wondering, as you're writing, how do they go together when you write? Is it just do they just appear together naturally and seamlessly, or does one ever predominate or occlude the other. That is the storytelling impulse and the idea of pursuing a sequence of sounds that seem right, that feel right.
Mhm.
Um, yeah,
Well, I think I can say safely that every single poem I've written has a story behind it. I don't sit down and say, I'm going to write a poem today about such and such. The poem comes to me from a context that is has some kind of narrative, whether it's personal or familial or social, whatever. Um, but I also do write some fiction, and I've published short stories, and so I'm aware of the different process of writing fiction. And I taught in my intermediate creative writing workshop at UMass Boston. I taught both the writing of poetry and the writing of fiction. And one of the distinctions, and I think I probably made this with the students, perhaps to no avail, but it certainly is a distinction I made for myself, was that writing a poem is kind of like sculpting. You have a rock and you chip at it until you get it to the point where you can see what it is. Whereas writing a story is more like a potter at a wheel, adding clay to the origin and building it up and expanding it and making it more more narrative. Um, and so I think that when I write a poem, I chip it down to that certain point where I recognize, okay, this is what the poem is. This is the poem that is emerging from the raw material. Um, and then the sonic aspect, I think, is just something that is innate to me, that I love the sound of words. I love wordplay.
yeah,
Um, Seamus Heaney has a wonderful expression that he uses to describe poetry in Irish. He talks about the verbal philandering of poetry in Irish. And I don't speak Irish. I wish I did, but I do like verbal philandering. I like words that shout out to each other across lines, sonically, whether that's with a
absolutely.
rhyme or whether it's assonance, consonants,
Mhm.
uh, and and so that I think is just intrinsic to who I am. But I think there's also an element of being a Prince Edward Islander. We're a conversational society. We tell stories, we laugh, we have some fun. Um, we we're pretty much self-deprecating, and we don't mind saying something that has some music to it.
Yeah, there's definitely there's an onomatopoeic quality sometimes.
Sure.
Just thinking of one of the poems, "Longing," where you talk about the white mare that clip clopped down the gravel path, and
Hmm.
the horses a little bit later in the poem that nuzzle each other and nicker. Um, yeah,
Hmm.
you refer to crunches and munches. Like this is it's very rich with sonic
Hmm.
implications
But it's also exactly what horses do. They crunch and they munch.
exactly, that's right. So it's
Horses pull the grass up.
yeah,
They don't nibble at grass. They unearth it.
yeah, I got it.
And
Yeah,
so the words, those are the right words to use. But again, serendipitously, they also kind of sing with each other. So it's just a gift that those happen that way.
yeah, it's really wonderful. Um, yeah. Another thing that I know that you're interested in is ulteriority. I saw you
Mhm.
say somewhere before um, that did you refer to this or did I get this somewhere else? So Wallace Stevens' line about reality is a cliche that we escape through metaphor. Or
Yes.
but by
Yeah.
metaphor we escape reality.
Yeah.
Cliche of reality I find really interesting.
Yes.
The idea of saying something askance, I'm very aware of this. I've been aware of this my whole life. That if you say something direct or just fairly factual, or you approach something head on, you don't quite see it as well as if you compare it to something, simile or metaphor and so on.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah,
so
well, I wrote a little piece on metaphor that was published last spring in the Fiddlehead magazine's online website, and I quoted Wallace Stevens in that regard. But I
right.
would also say, and this is one of the licenses that I gave my creative writing students every semester, and kind of tried to bait them with it, was a very simple line from Emily Dickinson: "Tell all the truth, but tell it slant."
Right.
Um, so I think that
Agree.
that is something that I again kind of instinctively practice. Uh, I'm not trying to give something that's necessarily literal. Um, and, um, and it's also, Wallace Stevens says, description is revelation. And so it is, and he says that it is not the thing described nor false facsimile. And so I think that that is part of the ulteriority that I like to practice. And that word ulteriority, um, I borrow from Robert Frost, who says that that is the secret of poetry, is not to say things in a straightforward way,
Mhm.
but to find a way to say it that engages, um, I think, the poet first, and then hopefully a reader, and draws them in and is an invitation to kind of play with an idea of something rather than to say, this is the blunt truth. So that, again, is at least my practice. And and that's what I hope my poems accomplish, uh, for me, first of all, and then for whoever may end up reading them, that there's some sort of pleasure, the pleasure of ulteriority, which is what Robert Frost actually is his phrase. So
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, maybe just as a final question, it's kind of connected to this, but I was curious about the epigraph. You have an epigraph by Thomas Transtromer, and
yes,
it's not translated. And one could say that, I guess, leaving untranslated language that's not in the principal language of the poem is maybe another way of saying something slant. But I did figure out what it says, and roughly, I don't know. What is it, Swedish or Danish? I did figure it
it's
out.
Swedish.
Swedish. Yes.
It's Swedish, and it actually is translated at the back of the book
Oh, is it? Oh, well,
on
that's
page 126. The epigraph. It's from a poem
the
by
notes. Oh my
by
God.
Stromer, and it translates as, "I didn't know which way to turn my head.
Interesting.
My visual field divided like a horse." And
Yeah.
I I first read Transtromer probably close to 30 years ago, and I fell in love with those particular lines
Yeah. I'm
because
curious to
I
know why.
felt that he captured something about how we may miss a lot. A horse's vision, as I understand it, a horse's eyes are independent of each other,
Yeah.
and that a horse can actually see 270 degrees around them.
Mm.
And I was very aware of this just a month ago. I was riding a horse out in Arizona for a week, and I was very aware of my horse, who was a wonderful horse named Commander. I've ridden him a couple of years in a row, and I was very aware that when I would, make a, a comment to him as we were riding, that I could see, he would turn his head slightly, and one of his eyes would be looking back at me, even though his head wasn't turned around. And I thought, this is exactly what Transtromer is writing about, is that capacity to see beyond the obvious that's right in front of us, and to see
Yeah.
something that's more encompassing. And so when I was putting together this volume, the new translation of Transtromer had just come out, in it's the translation called, The Blue House, translated by Patty Crane, and came out in 2023. And
Mhm.
so I bought it as soon as it came out, and I immersed myself in it and was reading it, and just feeling totally enriched by it. but those lines came back to me. I'd never forgotten them, but they came back to me, and I said, okay, I want to put that in as the epigraph. Putting it in Swedish, though, was also a very important thing for me to do, because for me, it represents a reminder that we're working with words, we're working with language.
The material.
And and so I hope that it doesn't come across as pretentious, because I do the translation at the back, but I
Yeah,
wanted,
you weren't hiding. Yeah,
I think a book of poems overtly and covertly is about language.
and yeah,
And and so this was a way to sort of say to anybody who picks up this book, hmm, why that? And so that's why that.
yeah. No, I don't mind it at all. I mean, yeah, we see words that we don't know, but we can also intuit a sense like sinbald. Like that's obviously the root sin is something to do with dualism or division.
Yep.
Yeah, I'm sorry I didn't notice it in the notes. I drenched up a translation that was slightly different. I don't know where I turned my head with a double field of vision like a horse. You know, you in your notes as you read before, it's with my visual field divided like a horse. You know, probably inconsequential differences there, but
Yep.
yeah, it's just interesting to think that as you were talking about the horse commander and the horse's experience of seeing you, it probably wasn't such a sense of division for the horse. It's probably, you know, cognitively adapted to synthesize different fields of vision. But the poet is imagining a sense of not knowing what to do about the
Yeah.
division. So,
Right. And when you're riding a horse in the Arizona mountains and you're a couple of thousand feet up, you want that horse to have good vision. And horses can see their own hind hoofs.
yeah,
And when you're looking over the edge of a precipice and seeing the rocks falling down, you're saying, I'm glad this horse has that range of vision, and the sure-footedness of it as well. Um, I wonder if you'd like me to go back to a question that you posed right at the first,
sure.
about the division of the book into two sections. Um, and actually the whole book is three sections, because it's Nuage, which is the new poems.
Yes.
Um, and there's a poem titled Nuage, which was the second poem I wrote when I moved to Indiana, just coincidentally. And it's a very slight poem,
Uh,
but I think the poem takes on a weight when we know that Nuage was a melody composed and played by Django Reinhardt that became the unofficial anthem of the French Resistance. And the poems, most of the new poems are from the last 5 to 7 years, when we've had so much trauma in our lives, through the COVID period, obviously, but now in the current state of America and of the world,
mm,
with the dreadful happenings all around us,
mm,
and the great evil that is all around us, as in the time of the Nazi regime, and of the proud and noble and valiant resistance that the French people presented during the Second World War, the heroism of it all. And so the poem accrued weight for me as the years came along, and more dreadful things happened. Um, and so I wanted that to be the title poem of the new poem. Despite its slightness, I felt that it was an invitation to consider the implications of that wistful, beautiful melody singing into the darkness that
yeah,
that, that surrounded them.
yeah,
So
but also there's as you're alluding to, an ominousness as well, and I guess
yes,
well,
yes, absolutely.
yeah,
And I believe that Django Reinhardt himself recorded 13 different versions of it, in different keys and with different instrumentation and so on. The version that I first heard and most in love with is the one with the quintet of the Hot Club of France with Stefan Grappelli on violin. So I mentioned that in the notes at the back as well. So that's that breakdown, and then the other two sections of the overall book are just selected poems from my first two books. But you alluded to Nuage having two sections, surfacing
Yeah.
and reckoning.
So it's just the
And
horse now. This is the horse's division.
well, not,
Right.
I didn't think of it that way.
Excuse me.
I thought of it as when I was arranging the poems and organizing the poems and trying to have poems that would speak to each other, not necessarily sequentially, but within a section.
Hmm.
Surfacing, there's a poem called Surfacing in the sequence called The River. It's the first poem, I think, in the
Yeah.
sequence of The River. And I'm looking out at the river right this second.
Mhm.
And we have cormorants on the river.
Yeah.
So it's a little poem about cormorants. If you
Lovely.
are observant of birds, you know that cormorants, unlike ducks, don't have enough oil in them to float above the surface. So they sink down, but then they come up and they stretch out and dry themselves out and go back through it all again. And that seemed what I was writing about was something that was literal, but again, the ulteriority of it. It's also metaphorical about how we all live our lives, trying to maintain the appearance of being above the surface and in control, but
Mhm.
that we are always up to our
In the
necks.
neck. Yeah.
Um,
Exactly. Yeah.
and so that poem perhaps resonates with a lot of the other poems in some way in that first section. And the second section, Reckoning, the poem, The
Mhm.
Reckoning, is a funny little poem that took me a long time to write, but it was based on an incident that I love was a real incident. It was about getting a haircut, and I mentioned in the poem I named the barber as Barbara Ann, which sounds a
Yeah.
little bit that your barber is Barbara Ann, but her
Like
name was
Beach Boys.
Bar- her name was actually Barbara, not Barbara Ann, but I
Okay.
needed Barbara Ann for the rhythm of it.
Yeah.
Uh, and she cut my hair only one time at my local barber shop. I think she was renting a chair for a month or something like that. And I went in and she said, "What can I do for you today?" And I said, "Can you take 10 years off me?" And she looked me up and down and she said, "Yeah, I'll see what I can do." And then at the end, it didn't end quite the way the poem ends, but at the end, she said to me, "Come back in a month, I'll get the other 5 years." And so again, it's a poem about aging, and it's a poem about engaging with aging, but
Yeah.
it's also tongue in cheek. It's
Yeah.
also having fun
Yeah.
with the
Sense of
idea
humor. Yeah. The
that
lightness. Yeah.
as I said in that little piece that I wrote on metaphor for the fiddlehead, not every poem has to carry the weight of the world, and so this is one that engages with other poems about aging and about you know, looking at oneself in time and in space. But I also just had a little bit of fun with it.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's important too. And yeah, even when you are engaging with poems that deal with the weight of the world, like the Nuage one you were referring to, you still have a moment of just enjoying a cup of coffee with your purring cats.
Yes,
Um,
yes.
even when there are dark clouds brewing,
Yeah.
uncertainty. So yeah, that's an
And,
important.
and trying to do something with words, as an act of very modest resistance, because I'm not in the front lines in Ukraine, and so I'm not doing something that is heroic, and I have no illusions or delusions about that. But sometimes just using what you've got to speak back to other forces around you is all that we can do.
Yeah, absolutely. Well said. Okay, well, that's a good place to end. Um, Thank you so much, Thomas.
Well, thank you, Scott.
And I'll just remind everybody that we have a launch of this wonderful work at the Friends Meeting House on May 10 in Cambridge, Boston at 4 p.m. So anybody who is watching this can hopefully come along if it's possible for them. And I will see you there.
Yes, I look forward to meeting you in person.
Okay.
Wonderful.
Yeah, thank you so much.